Another week and another compilation of my Spectrum videos from about 4 or 5 years ago. It's sort of a bit like Christmas, where you get a present and then you give it to someone else the next year, rewrapped it, you know. That's the best way of doing presents, isn't it? But yeah, this week we're going to be doing Spectrum games based on UK kids television. Very specific to us. Probably wouldn't have sold very well in Luxembourg. But yeah, if you're wondering where Nightmare is, which is currently on the screen now, I put it in the quiz show thing last week, so I didn't want to reuse it twice. I'm already rehashing stuff. I can't be that cheeky. But yes, please stay tuned for the next 2 hours for more entertainment involving shows that will make you feel warm in your nostalgic areas. Hopefully of your brain. Oh, and I think I'll split it into two, just because there's a lot of them and you probably don't want to be sat here for 4 hours. So stay tuned next week for part 2. Bangers and Mash started out as a series of reading books for young children in their first years of primary school. The books were written by Paul Groves and published by Longman Books in the mid-1970s. The illustrations in the books proved to be a winner with reluctant readers and normal readers alike. They remained a fixture of primary school bookshelves and libraries until Central Independent Television and Filmfare Productions put together 24 episodes for a TV series that was broadcast from July 1989 to September 1989 and repeated frequently on ITV up until about 1993. Bangers and Mash was about a pair of troublemaking chimps whose thirst for fun would usually end up with them bringing great misery to someone else, be it by creating a mess or breaking something belonging to their relatives. Petal, their mate, would try and bring them into line. It's probably most famous for its insanely catchy theme tune, sung by Rockney duo Chaz and Dave. Bangers and Mash, the video game, was published in 1992 by our old friends Alternative Software for the princely sum of £3.99. The game was also released on the Commodore 64 and the Amstrad CPC, and ended up appearing on Alternative's Kids Pack 2 the following year, with a host of other TV licenses previously released at a budget price. Somewhat disappointingly for the comedic duo, you only play as bangers here. Mash is sidelined, refusing to help collect fruit for Mum's pie, as he did the housework yesterday. Now, I'm not really sure what constitutes housework for a chimp, as most of the time I see them shitting in their own hand and flinging it away from themselves. At least that's my experience from visiting the zoo. It turns out that Mash is quite the smart bastard, as arch nemesis and witch Snitchnose has taken control of the denizens of the jungle and set them on a mission to stop Bangers getting all those fruits for Mum's pie. What an awfully petty witch. But I suppose Banger's mum is using an awful lot of fruit if we look at those counters for her pie, so maybe she's just trying to stop Bangers and Mash's mum from gutting the forest of all the food. It could lead to a famine across the whole of Chimptown for just one greedy woman's damn fruit pie. Maybe you're the hero that Chimptown needs, which Snitchnose. Bangers can repel aggressors by flinging mud pies at them, and as I've previously discussed, are we sure they're mud pies? Animals can be taken out of the game with one of these mud pies, but the army of the undead, be it ghosts or skeletons, can only be temporarily stunned, which is why Peter Venkman didn't utilise mud pies in the film Ghostbusters. Count Duckula was originally a recurring villain in Cosgrove Studios' Dangermouse and was given his own spin-off show on ITV that lasted from 1988 to 1993. It was voiced by Dangermouse alum and Trotter independent trader himself, David Jason. The Duckula of the eponymous series was notably different from his original mouse-bothering incarnation, notably because the night-crawling fowl of the spin-off was a mild-mannered vegetarian, as opposed to the bloodthirsty freak of the Dangermouse series. Accompanied by his dissatisfied butler Igor and his loyal nanny, who, by the way, has to be played by Miranda Hart in any live-action version, Duckula travels around the world in his teleporting castle as he searches for riches and fame. It's utterly charming, though not quite as serenely brilliant as its companion series Dangermouse. It's aged a lot better than a lot of other animated series of the time, and I'd say it's worth checking out. Count Duckula No Sax Please We're Egyptian was released in 1989 on all three main 8-bit computers as a budget title for the princely sum of just £2.99. I don't know why £2.99 is a princely sum. Just ask Prince Charles. I don't know. The game is based on the first episode of the show, the subtitle of which is a reference to a 1971 sex comedy play called No Sex Please We're British, which is a reference I'm sure every kid understood and found hilarious. It's probably referenced actually, as David Jason played the lead role in the play for a while, let's be honest. But, I've got to be facetious, haven't I? That's part of this job. Duckula must hunt through a labyrinthine pyramid within a tight time limit for his magical saxophone, or else his castle will leave without him and he will face being stranded in Egypt. It's pretty low stakes, isn't it, really? I mean, it's a bit annoying, but he could always go to the Romanian embassy in Cairo or something. I'm sure he'd get back eventually. So, the game. Visually, it's fine. Big monochrome sprites do a decent job of replicating the look of the show, if, of course, Count Duckula was a sombre black and white Austrian animated short about depressed ducks on the verge of suicide. The collision detection is a bit wild, and the single pyramid backdrop is as unvaried as you'd expect. The game is cheap and cheerful enough. It doesn't put up any trees, but it's a challenge and would have been a perfectly reasonable purchase for your £2.99. Your Sinclair scored it a pretty fair 73% of the time, saying it's a lot like a lot of other games, which I'd say is pretty accurate. It's unremarkable, very samey, but it's fun. Count Duckula 2. It's hard not to go full AVGN on this one. It is dire. And it's a platform game by Alternative Software, who are pretty much this series' version of Bulldog in Frasier. They're not in every episode, but whatever episode they're in is infinitely worse. Sorry, Bulldog fans. So yes, Alternative have come to smear perhaps their stinkiest arse egg onto my upper lip. The first game was a passable monochrome platformer, nothing particularly exciting, but a good waste of a Saturday afternoon for the lowly entry fee of just £2.99. You can't go far wrong with a £2.99 game, can you? Yes, you can. We're about to discover why. Playing Count Duckula 2 is your time stolen. It feels like it's been stolen like you're one of the children from the Fritzl family, and I feel I can get away with that joke now because it was so long ago. That's the second to last episode, so who cares? Duckula is on a space adventure on the planet Cute, and it is full of fluffy denizens who are determined to snap off his beak and shove it up his watertight bum. The game starts with you aboard a rocket made from the castle tower, and it's a pretty short and very dire vertical scrolling shoot-'em-up, so it is. Which actually turns out to be the game's highlight. The rest of the game, you see, is a platformer. The very worst section of the very worst level of the very worst platform game. But for its entire duration. Yes, it's a whole game of those really annoying bits in platformers where the platforms slowly disappear and appear in a sequential order. It is cripplingly slovenly to play, the antithesis of a game such as Sonic the Hedgehog or Super Mario World. It's a game of waiting around and then using the poor controls to leap between platforms. Platforms that you'll miss, that you'll misjudge, and you'll have a miserable time for the entire duration. So you better remember the sequences or you'll fall to your doom. It's really not very good at all, and I don't even want to talk about it anymore. Again, a bit like the tortured family of Joseph Fritzl. Yep, went back to that well again. Your Sinclair gave it an apocalyptic 9% and said that aiming this at a younger gamer is no excuse. What makes Alternative think they can get away with giving younger players such a rubbish game? Sinclair user could only recommend it to those who are fans of the TV series or are true platform fanatics, and they gave it a very gracious 64%. I don't know why they just didn't recommend it to perverts, because you'd have to be a pervert to enjoy this game. It is bloody shite. The song tells us that he is both amazing and fantastic, and yet somehow he's not so amazing as to avoid capture and to have lost his eye. And I really want to see that episode. I really want to see the episode of Dangermouse where he has his eye burnt or scooped out. I want to know what happened to that eye. Maybe he got attacked by a cat like Nick Fury in the Marvel films. Come on, Cosgrove Studios, give us the prequel where he gets his eye pulled out. That's what we all want to see, the gross torture of a children's character. Maybe we don't need to. Maybe it's in one of these 3 games. Let's have a look, shall we, at the trio of ZX Spectrum computer games based on Dangermouse, those being Double Trouble, Black Forest Chateau and Making Whoopee. Oh, matron. Before we point Iris at Vijo game, though, let us have the goosiest of ganders at its forefather, the wonderful animated series Dangermouse. Dangermouse was a 1980s animated series produced by Cosgrove Hall for Thames Television. It was a spoof of Patrick McGoohan TV show Danger Man, a 60s series about a secret agent called John Drake. There's obviously nods to James Bond too. I'm not going to discount those, but its original inspiration was Danger Man. Originally, Dangermouse was going to be a touch more serious in tone, something which can be seen in the pilot episode. Then, theme writer Mike Harding pointed out the absolute nonsense that the concept of a cartoon about a James Bond mouse was, and so it helped creators Mark Hill and Brian Cosgrove to change the show to suit its more ridiculous premise. Comedy actors David Jason and Terry Scott were brought in to play the eponymous hero and his hapless coward assistant Penfold, and a wonderfully strange pan-generational animated classic was born. Dangermouse had a revival series in the 2010s voiced by Alexander Armstrong and Kevin Eldon. It was pretty good too. Moving on to this particular show's games, Dangermouse in the Black Forest Chateau, Dangermouse in Double Trouble and Dangermouse in Making Whoopee were published in 1985 and 1984 by Creative Sparks. Creative Sparks were a small software house around for the first few years of the 8-bit system's existence, and they issued the 3 titles for the mid-price of $6.95 for the first 2 and $1.99 for Making Whoopee, the last game that they released in the Dangermouse series. When Creative Sparks folded in 1987, Alternative Software bought all 3 pieces of software and re-released them under their label. In a similar vein to our previous episode, Adrian Mole, the first Dangermouse game was an interactive fiction title, which is basically a text adventure where you don't have to come up with the instructions as the options come up on the screen and you have to select which one you want to do. The plotline has Jeff from Biker Grove facial head Spy Supremo and bald chinchilla apparently, Colonel K sending Penfold and DM to the Black Forest to deactivate the Pi Beam, the latest planet-threatening weapon utilised by the villainous Baron Silas Greenback. Look at him. As an entry-level text adventure, I think the Black Forest Chateau is pretty good. The multiple choice answers make it easier for beginners than stumbling through whatever words that the Spectrum has in its lexicon, and the still graphics are pretty well drawn, which is far from the usual with titles of this nature. If you can learn the world and pick up the right objects, you can move through the game pretty effectively. It's far from a punishing title, and its simplicity in this case is a boon for me, who is already dreading playing the text adventure likes of Dallas and Robin of Sherwood, almost as much as I didn't like playing the Masters of the Universe text adventure game. Penfold will occasionally drop a clue or two, and the dialogue is written in such a way as to quietly nudge you in the correct direction. It's a quick loader in terms of its locations and graphics, and the game is split into 2 bite-sized parts as you try and get a code that unlocks the second part of the game. A welcoming, if slightly easier than normal adventure, and one that Sinclair user rated an 8 out of 10, saying it's ideal for young adventurers and an enjoyable break for the seasonal adventurers not wishing to expend much brain power. Released in the same year as Black Forest Chateau was Double Trouble. This time we've got an arcade-style effort split into 3 parts. The pie-eating, wheezing, froggy kingpin himself, Greenback, is already up to no good because he's a bad guy and they get up to no good as a matter of point, hence the name Bad Guy. It could mean great peril for the world if Silas activates his sinister android clone, of course, that being a robot version of our hero, Dangermouse. Your first mission has Dangermouse and Penfold in the red upholstery of the yellow aero car as they travel to the jungle base of the well-dressed criminal amphibian. The troublesome Toad is not a fan of this incursion, so he has dispatched a lot of anti-mouse robots at the postbox dwelling pair. These can be taken down by using a musical weapon, but you will need to choose which robot to blast on the harder difficulty levels with a particular note for each one. On the easier setting, it's a bit immaterial. It will blast for you, and so sort of ruins the whole point of the level. But you know what, I'm down for that. When you've flown far enough into the jungle, you will land, and here you'll have to hare it through the rainforest, leaping crocodiles and clambering up tree bark to avoid the attentions of monkeys and mouse-eating pumas. This bit controls reasonably well, I suppose. It's nothing to write home about, but it's a fairly non-offensive, fairly playable platform section. If you get through the greenery, it's into the lab of Greenback, where he and his assistant Stiletto the Crow are attempting to animate the robot doppelganger of London's most daring vermin. Here we're in a very visually pleasing, characterful puzzle game scenario, as Greenback and Mouse have to compete to activate lights in their colour. It sort of works a bit like drafts in the fact that you draw lines with the lights, and you have to obviously get the majority of the lights to win. I think it's a bit like drafts. I don't really play drafts, so I don't really know. The Penfold and Nero animation is quite funny though, as Nero chases Penfold through the factory. It's nice that they've tried to do something a bit different with the license rather than a pure platformer, and variety is the spice of life. And spice is good at this stage of my life, because to taste spice is to have a burning sensation in my mouth and therefore feel something. Yeah. Double Trouble is good to very good for DM fans, but perhaps less interesting to general arcade fans, say Crash magazine in their November 1984 edition, and they gave it a 75% overall. The February 1985 Your Sinclair precursor Your Spectrum gave it a 4 out of 5, saying that the graphics are superb and that there are lots of nice touches that mark this as a very well thought out game. Sinclair user said the following in their December 1984 issue, coupled with an 8 out of 10. This game should keep any ageing youngster entertained for hours, and that the only danger is that the real youngsters might not get a look in. The third and final part of Creative Spark's Dangermouse Trilogy, because duh, if it's the third part, it's obviously going to be the final part of a trilogy. Do you know how trilogies work? Is making whoopee. The saucy title derives from the bulbous baron's latest scheme to manufacture enough whoopee cushions to hide on the chairs of every seat in the United Nations Council. At the next summit, bottoms will meet rubber, air will noisily expel like the shout of a charging turd from a rump piece, and everyone in that meeting will have to apologise in every language possible. This will obviously be immensely time-consuming, what with all the different languages, and so will leave the path clear for the fiendish frog to dominate the world. In essence, with this plot, Creative Sparks have shown that they completely understand the sense of humour of the animated version of Dangermouse, and hats off to them, that is a great plot. There's no Penfold with you this time, as Greenback has kidnapped the Greg Wallace in Boris Johnson suit lookalike urchin, so DM will have to do this one all alone. The objective is to shut down enough whoopee factories dotted around the city to prevent the dastardly plan from taking shape. We're back in the aero car for this as we drive around a city, with the top screen representing a three-dimensional mouse car perspective and the bottom half showing the city layout itself. The green crosses represent trolls who have special requirements for items before letting you past. A dead end will usually incorporate a doorway. That doorway will lead you onto a platform section, and by manoeuvring DM through a maze of doors and jumping a lot of different obstacles that are usually bubbles, you can get to the right door, and behind that door you should be able to find an object that will let you progress past the trolls. So yes, that's the conceit of the game. You've got to do all this, by the way, before Silas Greenback makes his full arsenal of guff sounders, though, so you're under a bit of a time limit. Out of the three titles, I think this is probably the weakest. The car manoeuvring makes sense on paper, but is an absolute mess in practice, and as it's 75% of the game, you should probably get your Del Boy voiced mouse fun from one of the other titles in this list. I'm not a fan of this one, it must be said, although I did like the plot line. Crash said it wasn't a bad piece of cheapo software. It would be nice if it was just a little bit more compelling. They gave it 56% in their September 1986 issue. Your Sinclair, though, they really liked it actually, and thought a 8 out of 10 was a fair score in their October 1986 edition. They called it a right little cracker that deserves to bubble right to the top of the charts, because it's got bubbles in it, you see. CNVG gave it the once over in November 1986. They reckoned that the graphics are average, the sound the same, and the gameplay is basically frustrating. Nice idea, shame about the game. Yeah, I'm with them. A mixed bag then from the United Kingdom's most heroic cheese-nibbling rodent. Hand puppets are strange. They are basically anthropomorphised gloves. But on the right hand, or the left, I'm not being handist, such as a genius like Jim Henson, the puppet can convey a range of emotions from joy, to fear, to pathos, to absolute hysteria. Alternatively, you could just whack a green mohawk on a dog toy and get a well-dressed arm to threaten it in between Dogtanyan and Grange Hill in a small room. And that is Edd the Duck, begat by Gordon the Gopher, succeeded by Otis the Aardvark, who accompanied Andy Crane and Andy Peters as they cheerfully read out viewer birthdays in the old CBBC broom cupboard. For most of us back then, television was just 4 channels, apart from the rich kids who had that satellite television that had Bart Simpson and the Ultimate Warrior on it. Suffice to say, nearly every 6 to 11-year-old in the country was familiar with Edd the Duck and his adversary Wilson the Butler in the late 80s to early 90s. Performed by BBC assistant producer Christina Mackay Robinson, who would add his distinctive green mohawk a little while after his debut, which he got, by the way, by desecrating the carcass of a Blue Peter punk teddy bear to get. That's dark, isn't it? Jeez. Children's television. Making his debut in 1988, the waterfowl grew in popularity and would be completely hoarded out by the BBC merchandising department. Milkshakes, mugs, replica toys and an obligatory terrible single, think about Bob the Builder and Mr Blobby, to see how awful that can turn out. Well, I say it's awful, but it was called Awesome Dude, and dude was spelled incorrectly, so it wins many 90s nostalgia points for its absolute front, but it's rubbish, so it loses those points. But as I'm not sure there's actually a contest going on, I'm not sure what those points mean, and I'll now keep quiet about it. Regardless to say, the Edd the Duck song is terrible. But what else to say about Ed, aside from his continued abusive relationship that he had with the former alleged royal butler, Wilson, who Andy Peters seemed to turn a blind eye towards. This is how domestic violence happens. It's awful. Well, he was also the team mascot for the 1992 Great Britain Olympic squad, before they were annoyingly called Team GB. The 92 Olympics were most famous for two things, that Freddie Mercury song and the tabloids being absolutely obsessed with Linford Christie's junk. Other than that, Edd the Duck is allegedly a Blackburn Rovers fan, although Blackburn Rovers were obviously really good for about a year in the early 90s, and I don't know if anyone has seen Edd the Duck on the stands of Ewood Park since. I suspect not. He's a Glory supporter. And it just so happens that his glory matched up with their glory, and now, like, him and Colin Hendry are just sort of sitting under a flyover drinking cider and crying. Because, yes, Edd the Duck left the broom cupboard in 1992, and other than some kind of nostalgic appearances here and there throughout the years, he's not appeared since. Mind you, he's a squeaky toy. I don't know really what he brings to the table. Couldn't host current affairs shows, could he? Maybe he could. Edd the Duck, the video game, was produced by Impulse Software in 1990, with a re-release coming from Zeppelin a couple of years later. The plot is that Ed must explore the former BBC HQ, the television centre in White City, London, venturing through various sets and departments like the weather set and the special effects studio, collecting 20 stars per area to confirm him as a legitimate megastar. They made Clooney do that on the set of ER. He did, he had to collect little stars. It's not true. But then not a lot on this channel is. I said in the Minder video that Mercury's moon was Phobos, when in fact Mercury doesn't even have moons. Phobos is of course a moon of Mars. You're not here for facts. You're here to listen to me waffle nonsense. The stars are very important, as you need to collect 20 to finish each level. It's worth pointing out that the original version of this game on the Spectrum was impossible to complete because level 7 only had 19 stars. Oopsie! Later versions, including the hacked one I'm playing here, restored that missing star and made the game finishable, although it didn't, because it's bastard hard. It's actually very tricky initially, with the freeze cannon not being nearly as effective as the total obliteration dealt out by the rainbows of Rainbow Islands. It certainly makes the game an edgy experience and a whole lot tougher, particularly when combined with the erratic movement of some of the villains like this bee. So despite being aimed at the same sort of audience as the television product, in other words pre-teens, Edd the Duck is bastard hard. It's a reasonably pretty game packed with colour, but there is a tribute clash in abundance. And the scrolling, well, that can be as jerky as a chicken meal served up by a grandma in Jamaica. Edd the Duck is a reasonable game and a pretty good tie-in. I had fun with it for sure, although it was occasionally frustrating. I feel the decision to go with a freeze cannon instead of a more permanently effective weapon was definitely a wrong one. Edd the Duck was also released on the Amiga, the Amstrad CPC, the Atari ST and the Commodore 64. With a very poorly received Wild West themed sequel appearing as an Amiga exclusive in 1992, titled Edd the Duck, Back with a Quack. You got to admire that, haven't you? That's a very punny title. No, you don't. Fireman Sam was a Welsh fireman brought to life by the same stop-motion deviltry that gave life to work-shy cat owner Postman Pat. Starting in 1987, the series was the concept of two London firemen who approached Mike Young, the creator of Super Ted, with the idea of making a series that taught children about fire safety. The series has shown real longevity, with a switch to even more solid CGI in the mid-2000s, continuing the adventures of firefighter Samuel Jones until this very day. He lives in a very small village called Pontypandy that seems to have a lot of fires. This is because of 7-year-old Norman Price, a one-child sociopathic crime wave. Nearly every calamity in the sleepy village is a result of his wanton desire for destruction. Norman will have a cellar full of crying, rocking and the dead by the time he is 23. Mark my words, that kid is a piece of The game is surprisingly tricky for a title aimed at ankle gnawerers. It's once again a bit hamstrung with confusing controls. My first mission as a rookie firefighter was to put out a fire at the house of Sam's colleague Penny. Even after consulting the instructions, it's not immediately clear how you get the water through the hose to the fire, and as such the house is reduced to rubble in minutes. We never find out how the fire was caused, but you'd think that fireperson Penny might be smart enough not to leave a fork in the microwave or not to leave her lit hair straighteners on the king-size duvet. She doesn't even show up at the fire, so she must be on holiday or... Oh my god. In between fires and other disasters like shitbag Norman getting his head stuck in things, you have to tear around Pontypandy looking for lost keys and kites, which seems like a desperately poor use of publicly funded resources. Maybe the firemen get bored waiting for Norman in between his school expulsions. The fire engine in this section steers like an obese mammoth in a small convenience store. Look at this! Look how stuck I am! It's ridiculous! So narrow are the roads of Pontypandy that after bouncing from roadside to roadside for minutes, you find out that you have to get around how you can. And if that means driving at full whack backwards down narrow, sleepy rural streets in a fire engine, then so be it. It's pretty lawless an environment anyway, thanks to this pint-sized Chris Evans of crime. I hate you, Norman! The game, another budget title released at the end of the Spectrum's life, is colourful, with the engine sections being a bit of a varied visual treat after playing the other two games. Your Sinclair awarded the game 70% at release, saying it was very playable in the short term. I'm inclined to agree. Giddy game show then. I've got a reasonable excuse for this one, to be fair. The show started in 1985 and was designed for preschool children. And well, I wasn't in preschool then, I was in full school, and those lazy pant-wetters were watching television shows at like 10:30 in the morning while I was slaving hard at the age of 6, putting sand through spinning wheels and perfecting my drawing of the letter B. Giddy Game Show was made by Yorkshire Television and lasted just the 2 series. The show featured the titular Giddy, who was an alien. Giddy scooted around on a magic pink pencil. Yes, that's what your mum called her magic pink pencil, wasn't it? And it was around the confines of an observatory. Giddy would indulge his nappy-wearing viewers with a series of simple games and puzzles, and would do so accompanied by his pals Gus the scientist and Gorilla the... Yes. That. Giddy was voiced by South African voiceover and ITV continuity announcer Redvers Kyle. Gus was given his speech by Richard Vernon, a character actor most famous for playing Slarty Bartfast in both the radio and TV show versions of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Finally, the cast is rounded out by the gorilla, who was voiced by none other than Carry On style Bernard Bresslaw, which, for some reason, and no offence to Bernard Breslaw's surviving family, is the perfect voice for an anthropomorphic gorilla. Cheers, Bernard. Mirrorsoft released the Giddy game show Spectrum game for the full price of £9.95 in 1986, right in the middle of the show's run. It also came out on the BBC Electron, and this won't surprise you whatsoever, but it's an edutainment game. It's actually really similar in its design to Mirrorsoft's fellow edutainment title, Mr. Men's Fun with Words. The sprites are huge, chunky characters for the most part, with zero animation. The game is split into 4 mini-sections, though sadly you won't find them all in this decidedly unthorough review for reasons I'll go into in a minute. The first stage is, plainly speaking, not a game at all, and only vaguely interactive. You select your grouping of letters and an object will appear that starts with that letter, and you press space once. Then the screen will either noisily clear or a character will, rather embarrassingly looking, just shimmy off with 0 frames of animation, and then the next object will appear, and then you press space, and then the same thing happens. It's a slideshow of lettered objects. At least the next game, though, is a little bit more interactive. Giddy takes exception to the English language and blows up our letters with his mind bullets. He then realises quite how rude that is to his hosts and how much they'll struggle without language and communications, and so enlists the player to reassemble the letters for him. You do this by pressing any other button than space to move through the options of broken letterage, and then press the space key for Giddy to shoot it again with his mind bullets and move it back into place. Honestly, Giddy, it's genuinely surprising you made it across the vast cosmos of space, given that you can't do a 4-piece jigsaw puzzle. Like, the nearest star other than the sun is 27,000 years worth of travel away. For goodness sake, man. Now, the reason I can't show you levels 3 and 4 is because I got intensely bored. I think the game actually wants you to reassemble every single letter in this manner, and after 12 of these tasks I was so bored that this was simply not going to happen on my day off. Here, have a screenshot of level 3. I bet that was fun. It looks fun, doesn't it? 2 magazines reviewed Giddy Game Show. Crash magazine had a look at Giddy in their issue 34, but as they often did with educational titles, didn't provide a score. They said that it was a very enjoyable little game which motivates young children to succeed. Sinclair User reviewed Giddy Game Show and did give it a score in their issue 49. They gave it a 2 out of 5 and said that perhaps computer games should only teach about computers, while teaching to read should be left to books. And this game does nothing to prove the contrary. It's my opinion, though, that games like Playdays and Shoe People have shown that actually you can do this well, and if you take your time and do it well, then you'll have an enjoyable game at the end of it that is also educational. Giddy Game Show, well, didn't do that. I was in a bit of a quandary about reviewing Gilbert Escape from Drill. You see, the way I format this show, with a preamble and history about the television show or character on which the game is based, before going into the gameplay, well, it's going to end up being very similar to Slope's Game Room video about Gilbert Escape from Drill that he put out 3 years ago. Luckily, the sound, editing and general quality of my video will be much lower, and hopefully this will differentiate enough between the two where he doesn't accuse me of plagiarising him. My low self-esteem is not always a barrier to glorious mediocre victory. So, self-degradation and piteous nature reveal done, let's go. Get Fresh was a mid-80s Saturday morning show. These were a popular thing at the time, when children would celebrate the 2 days of weekly freedom with a bowl of cereal and perhaps utilising a family dog as a cushion as they sat right in front of the television, and this gala of awkward interviews, noisy, way too hyped up production staff, cheery, calm, professional presenters, and musical performances from musicians up 6 hours before they normally awaken, performing songs that are by now distant nostalgic memories of a time when everything was possible, the summer sky was limitless and impossibly blue, and life wasn't a constant loop of dull, sleeping, eating, working, eating, sleeping, working. Sigh, that is the longest sentence I've ever committed to. Some of us were just watching programmes like Get Fresh, Live and Kicking, Going Live, Number 73 or Ghost Train to get to the juicy, delicious cartoon shows. Get Fresh, for instance, premiered Centurions. I made a video about that game, so that's a terrible game, and you can watch that video probably at a link if I can remember to put it in. So, Get Fresh then, presented by Gaz Top, who is or was married to Violet Berlin from Bad Influence. Get Fresh was also the pioneer of embarrassing yourself by trying to play a video game on national telly using a telephone with roughly 4 Google Stadia's worth of lag as you desperately tried to win a skateboard or an NES or, a slime pit by flailing about on Xenon on the Amiga. So there already are a couple of game links from Get Fresh. Tenuous ones, I'll give you. In the first series, Get Fresh was co-presented by Adrian Mole actor Gian Sammarco. And then someone decided that he was so bad that even a hideous stream of consciousness spewing snot factory lump of latex would be better. That lump would end up being named Gilbert The Alien. Poor Adrian Mole. Gilbert was a shambolic out-of-worlder and stowaway on the show set, the potentially libelously named Millennium Dustbin. This fellow was no doubt designed to appeal to the likes of boys aged between 6 and 12, whose comedy once ranged from scatological to even more scatological. Farts, gore, poo, vomit, wee, snot, anything vaguely moist that is usually kept inside the body triggers something primal in kids of a certain age. They just find it hilarious. And they don't even know about spunk yet. You just wait until children find out about that. Apropos of children finding out about spunk, nothing to do with it at all. Here's a scene of Gilbert meeting Roland Rat and Jimmy Savile. Anyway, this lowbrow attempt at getting young eyes on Gilbert totally worked. He was immensely popular, just as popular as Gordon the Gopher or Edd the Duck, but way, way grosser. Look at Gilbert, just look at him. He's designed by nightmares. He's so gross. Get him out of my sight. But he was a runaway success who would go on to have 2 spin-off shows from Get Fresh, those being the Tyne Tees Productions Gilbert's Fridge in 1988 and Gilbert's Late in 1990. I've never seen Gilbert's Late. Hopefully he didn't die in it. Apart from his grossness, a lot of Gilbert's appeal came from a really good performance from comedian and impressionist Phil Cornwell, a Spitting Image regular. Cornwell basically plays Gilbert as an East End wide boy, and he quipped and ad-libbed his way through conversations with a variety of celebs and hosts. He's effortless at times, incredible, and a key contributor to Gilbert's 80s success. Then, when the 90s hit, people moved on, snotty-nosed aliens were out, and sheep that looked like they were in the boy band Bros were in. Well, either Bros or that late-night gay exchange advert from the mid-90s. I say that, but no one made a Spectrum game about Nobby the Sheep, so he was never in. No one remembers Nobby the Sheep, or cares about you, Nobby the Sheep. Nobby the Sheep, go away, you're rubbish, mate. Gilbert Escape from Drill was the one and only computer game based on the short-lived nasal mucus oozing phenomenon, and it was also released on the MSX, the Amstrad CPC and the Commodore 64. The game was released by short-lived software house Again and developed by Enigma Variations, who are no strangers to TV show adaptations on the 8-bit computers, putting out games we've already looked at on this channel like Super Ted and Count Duckula, and ones we've yet to get to like Thomas the Tank Engine, Defenders of the Earth, Sooty, Postman Pat and the Wombles. They also did the recently covered Official Father Christmas game, which I feel I can't dwell on because talking about Christmas just after it's happened feels really weird. The plotline to Gilbert's game is this. On his return to his home planet Drill, Gilbert's civilization have quickly grown weary of the motor-mouthed bogey sprayer and his prodigal son boasting of a TV career on a faraway planet. So the spiteful and envious denizens of Drill have bitterly broken up the Millennium Dustbin into 5 bits and scattered it across the planet like a bunch of arseholes. Why can't this guy have success? Why do you have to be this way, people of Drill? Gilbert must traverse through the fast food restaurants, city streets, sewers, milk bars, oceans and jungles of his home planet to collect and reassemble his trusty spaceship and get it across the infinite blackness of space within 24 hours to renew his contract with Tyne Tees Television. Maybe the canon outcome of this is that he failed to do it, given the fact that the ugly git hasn't appeared on television since. Forever trapped on his home planet, kicking himself with his single foot that his fellow jealous planet dwellers thwarted his stardom. It's either that, or Snot only has a very limited shelf life from a humour point of view, also a very limited shelf life from an edible point of view. Please don't eat Snot, it's disgusting. The game is presented in a style similar to that of one of my all-time favourite Spectrum games, that being Jack the Nipper, with its sprawling 4-directional map and a very similar perspective to that game. It's definitely a game that benefits from a map, what with the 24-hour time limit that acts also as an energy bar. You'll find that your time is ebbed away super quick by collisions with the respawning mugwump oafs that fling themselves at our oozing anti-hero. These can be defeated by gobbing at them. Gobbing at people is a wonderful lesson for 80s children. It's how I've diffused every argument I've ever had since I acquired this game in 1989. It works every single time to get you into hospital with a broken face. You can't just troop around and find the pieces though, even if you know exactly where they are from previous playthroughs. No sir, you have to find the arcade machines in the many milk bars around Drill's cityscape. Each of the 5 simple mini-games will give you a clue to the whereabouts of the ship piece. They're not particularly good mini-games, but they're a nice little distraction. They didn't have to put them in, and they're perfectly serviceable. Once you've unlocked the clues, you can toddle off slowly on your single slug hoof. Drill is varied, unlike the single topological features of a Star Wars movie. One up to Gilbert there for understanding that planets are usually quite different. Make sure you take out a few enemies along the way, as they will drop a can of beans, which you will need, of course, because it will give you the ability to propel yourself upwards to some of the more difficult to access ship pieces. Yes, of course, by the power of botty burp guffery grunts, you can loft yourself into the sky. Did I say Gilbert was a one-trick pony? Why, I take it back. It's not just Snot after all. It's his botty burps as well. So how does Gilbert measure up? It's okay. He's painfully slow to move about, be it on the land, in the air, or swimming around. The enemies are absolutely relentless in their attack patterns, and Gilbert has to stop before he can rattle up a greenie out of his throat, which slows you down even more. I can't really criticise it too much though, as he doesn't move much slower than my beloved Jack the Nipper. Other than that, it's a game which is a fair challenge, and you know what, it's okay, it's pretty alright. Nothing to write home about, but then if you're writing letters home to your parents about old Spectrum games following the misadventures of a disgusting latex puppet with a permacold, you need to stop doing that, because I think your parents may start to worry a bit about you, or at least be very disappointed. Presentation wise, the 128K music is jaunty enough, and the Gilbert sprite is a fine representation of the drooling buffoon. Whoever passed the colour clash though, in the eye-searing horror that is the milk bar, is a sadist and a bellend. Yeah, okay, I'll cover it. If you don't turn down the Class A narcotics from the pusher, you are very much going against the number 5 Peking hit song that the cast sung. You don't care about Zamo's woe in that arcade toilet, and most importantly, how Nancy Reagan met everyone involved in that storyline. And you've killed Digital Gonch, who up until now was a happy-go-lucky Arthur Daly as a child comedic figure with no interest in drugs. You monster. Yes, I have to get that covered right at the start, because everyone who knows this game knows that this one scene is the most important bit of it, and it's been covered by better content creators on YouTube already. I don't really want to talk about it too much, yet I've started my video off with it. That's a very inconsistent message, I'm sure you'll agree. But as it's a Spectrum game based on a TV show, I do have to traipse this well-trodden path to have this complete list, and I do have to mention this bit, which has now taken up well over a minute of the recording, which will be the longest segment of it. I've actually, by trying to not talk about the drug dealer bit, turned it into a longer bit about that, and now I'm just waffling. But scag needles are just the tip of the danger that faces the pupils of this North London comprehensive school. Yes, there's far more dangers, and we will get to them in a bit. Grange Hill was the brainchild of Liverpudlian screenwriter and producer Phil Redmond, who also created the now defunct soap Brookside and the still going soap Hollyoaks. Last time I watched Hollyoaks, its cast was nearly exclusively young blonde models. Can't think why that's still going. Grange Hill ran from 1978 until 2008 on the BBC and was unflinching in its gritty portrayal of a rough London secondary. Redmond had several meetings with the heads of Children's BBC about it going a bit too far in its controversial themes. It's worth noting that most other school-based dramas for kids were generally pretty idealised, with maybe a dodgy bully here and there. Grange Hill had no time for such pussyfooting around though, as well as the most infamous incident, that of course being Zamo's run-in with Mr. Brownstone. The show dealt with fatal bullying, suicide, racism, the dangers of fiberglass, fires, rape, and featured and normalised people with disabilities. It sounds like I'm roping in normalising people with disabilities in with loads of bad things. I'm keen to point out that that's not true, and I want to go on record to say that I don't hate people with disabilities. That Grange Hill had the front and the bravery to confront these issues is very good for society. These were all real issues. It was good that the show wasn't afraid to show them just after, say, Willy Fogg or Dogtanian or Thundercats. Was Dogtanian on ITV actually? I'm not sure. If it gets kids talking though, or thinking about these issues, that's a good thing indeed, isn't it? Grange Hill's heyday was in the 80s, and so we shouldn't be massively surprised that a computer game existed of it, when most TV shows had a game on 8-bit computers. We're on episode 75 at this point, let's not forget. It was released on the 8-bit formats by Argus Software, the publishing house behind Chubby Gristle and the gloriously titled Peter Shilton's Handball Maradona, and they would eventually go on to become Grand Slam and release games like Thunderbirds and the Flintstones. It was programmed by Binary Design, who made the previously covered Star Wars Droids and Bob's Full House. In the game, you control Gonch, the wily, opportunistic wheeler-dealer comedy relief of the series. Gonch was one of the show's best and most beloved characters, a youthful ginger amalgam of popular adult telly characters and chancers like Del Boy off Only Fools and Horses and Minders Arthur Daly. He was often accompanied by his version of Rodney or Terry McGann, that being the loyal yet often mistreated Hollow, who follows Gonch in this game, when he pissing wants. The storyline is a sort of mirror of Gonch's first storyline appearance in the TV show, when he had his rather flashy Walkman confiscated by the school. Rather than face the wrath of his mother for losing this important and still very up-to-date form of electronic entertainment, Gonch persuades Hollow to accompany him in a daring raid on the school grounds to sequester his beloved item back before midnight. Therein follows a graphical side-view flick-screen adventure rendered wonderfully in black and cyan with a map that is incredibly confusing.
Which was the style at the time? No!
The puzzles generally make sense, which is a bonus, with objects generally having a logical use based on what they do. The menu controls, not so logical. They're a mixture of selectable menus and text inputs, which is a bit of a garbled mess at the best of times, particularly when engaging in conversations. You'll be having a lot of conversations with Hollow, who tends to get very bored and tired traversing over 3 whole screens, which is about 20 foot. Keep up, you short, blonde nincompoop. Come on. Still, with all the rooftop scurrying and telephone box climbing involved, with just getting to the schoolyard, you can probably understand why Hollow's such a lazy bastard. Another issue with the menu controls is that Caps Shift +1 is used to exit the menu, which is fine after a while, but it's an incredibly irritating combo to remember when one key would ultimately suffice. Another interesting quirk of the fictional borough of Northam is that nearly everything can instantly kill you, not just heroin. I'm pretty sure if the series had continued another 10 years, it probably would have addressed these fascinating social issues and problems, such as the fatalistic nature of completely stationary false teeth and a slightly raised paving slab that is just outside Gonch's house that, when you walk into it, can kill your copperhead entrepreneur unless he vaults over it. Mind you, his vault is pretty good. You know, for someone that's so incredibly brittle, the boy can certainly leap. I think he needs to get himself into that long jump team at Grange Hill, don't you, Luke Gonch Gardner? Still, what an incredibly dangerous area of London Northam appears to be. The quick, sharp deaths to small dogs and canal dipping are a hindrance to this game, unfortunately. There's no save feature. Well, there is if you emulate it like I am, but not on your 1987 ferric tapes, giving the game an extra level of arbitrary challenge that worsens the experience. It's challenging enough without this mechanic. Thanks very much. The graphics are pretty average, with rigid animations for our 2 lead characters, who are sort of kinda recognisable monochrome interpretations. If you squint a little bit, maybe a lot, okay, you might actually need to rewire your eyes and then pretend that they look like the characters they are. Overall, if I was grading Grange Hill as a teacher, it would be a C- bordering on a D. School days and back to school are far better swat-em-ups, deserving of an A star. And, get this, you can even change the names of the characters in those games if you wish to match your favourite Grange Hill alumni, if you so wish. It's sort of like an 8-bit Spectrum version of Pro Evolution Soccer, but with pencils and school ties. Reviews were mixed for Grange Hill. Crash gave it a 70% overall in their May 1987 issue, stating that it's an interesting theme and in some ways interesting to play, but ultimately it is fundamentally flawed. Your Sinclair gave Grange Hill a 6 out of 10 in their May 1987 issue, saying, "Are we going to see Gonch trying to flog copies of Grange Hill in the playground? Well, if he can put them out at half price, he might get a chance, but at $9.95, he'll get a knuckle sandwich." I miss the word knuckle sandwich. Well, 2 words, knuckle sandwich. Sinclair user gave it a 4 out of 5 in their April issue, the highest score yet. They put it to you that it's a curious mixture of adventure and arcade game. Some good puzzles should give it some appeal. Pigs. They're funny, aren't they? Sometimes they're being ridden by baby monkeys. Sometimes they're used to dispose of the bodies of the enemies or nemesis of East End gangsters. They also have a ton more differently named meats harvested from their bodies than other animals. Take that, the cow and the chicken. Screw you guys. Pork, ham, bacon, sausages. Some opportunistic prick even sold lumps of their skin in packs like crisps. Scratchings? How hard do you have to scratch to tear off a chunk of flesh like that? One even had an affair with a British Prime Minister while he was still at college. Allegedly. Now, Huxley Pig was a pig, funnily enough, who neither ate, got eaten, or had sex with any human being, because he was a short-lived English stop-motion animated TV series, and that would frankly be quite unlikely to happen at 4 o'clock in the afternoon on ITV. Instead, Huxley was daydreaming about different adventures and professions. That's far more innocent than any of the other things that involve pigs. He would dress up as these different professions and characters he was thinking about and ponder what fun he would have had, along with his friend Sam the seagull, who, unlike other gulls, isn't a squawking piece of shit that attacks people, steals their stuff, and apparently bites their testicles. Joining the pair were Vincent, a vampire pig butler, Horace, the con artist hamster, Cuddles the beast, and Sydney the lisping snake. Yeah, a real diverse set of characters there. Originally produced by Filmfare for Central TV, Huxley Pig lasted just 26 episodes from 1989 to 1990. It also had this theme tune, which is an absolute banger. Listen.
A new dream every day, Huxley Pig.
Huxley Pig was yet another bizarre developments produced alternative software budget release, retailing at $2.99. Huxley Pig was a flip-screen, side-scrolling platformer. Coming out in 1991, Huxley is tasked with finding costumes in this huge house. That Out of Court payoff by David Cameron must have been huge. Huxley's house is pretty enough, with good use of colour, albeit a little bit samey here and there. There's a few different background designs that come up, but we are, of course, dealing with the limited memory of the Spectrum. Huxley also walks as if his front leg has had all its bones removed, and then had the resultant floppy, fleshy leg flooded with enough electricity to toast a bacon slice on a laptop. His friends, like Vincent, act like bastards and move the costumes around when he wants to have an occupational wank fantasy. As soon as Huxley locates his costumes, he puts them on and indulges himself on various mini-games, all found on side 2 of the tape, which form the second part of the game. The pilot's uniform throws Hux behind the yoke of a plane. Then he gets all sweaty about making pizzas, presumably not meat feasts or Hawaiians, else that stuff's a little bit too dark for me. And finally, he decides to go in a speedboat and dodge loads of old junk that coasts towards him. Can't really tell this is a Huxley Pig game, really, from the screenshot, but there you go. Mostly the game is fine, however, the numerous spiders that scuttle about are sometimes near impossible to jump over, with Huxley's pork loin unable to get the muscle and strength enough to get the height needed to vault these annoying arachnid bar stewards. The idea is that you jump on chairs, toilets, tables, and things to avoid them, but it's not always that the furniture you need is conveniently placed for when these little beggars arrive. And some of these spiders also move faster than a greased ketchup-covered sausage in a fat guy's mouth. I gave up after a little bit, and so much of this footage is from our ZX archive because I can't be expected to finish a game aimed at maladroit toddlers. I didn't know collecting toys helped extend your life bar when I played it, and eating sandwiches extend your time, and now I do. Sinclair user gave Huxley Pig a very generous 88% in their March 91 edition, whereas your Sinclair gave it a quite harsh 30% in their April 91 edition. It's neither as great as Sinclair user say or as bad as your Sinclair say. It's in the middle, in my opinion, because I often squat in the middle of these things as not to offend producers of games made in 1991. Imagine being offended by that. So, chop chop, I'll stop porking, as I am not going to give it a glowing recommendation, but I can't say much beyond that. Is it a wiener? No, you'll know for yourself if you get this gam on your spectrum. Yes, it's puns about pig flesh. Feels a bit dark, really. Magic Roundabout, eh? They must have been on them there, the drugs. All the drugs. Everything up from antihistamines. So, what's this all about? Well, there was a French series called Le Ménage Enchanté that premiered in 1963. It was a charming stop-motion animation that had more than 400 episodes. And as you can see, it's the Magic Roundabout. Except it's not the Magic Roundabout at all. You see, that's not Dylan, it's Floppy. That's not Florence, it's Margot. That's not Dougal, it's, and I'm very serious when I say this, it's Pollux. Yes, Pollux. You see, the BBC initially rejected La Ménage Enchanté because they felt it wouldn't translate very well. So what they did do was they did basically what Saban would do with Super Sentai and Kamen Rider some 30 years on. Yes, they did a bit of a Power Rangers, because what they did was they took all the original footage and got Emma Thompson's dad Eric to recut the old footage, change the character names, make all new English language scripts and tell brand new stories with that re-edited footage. And you know what? It bloody well worked. It's a ruddy cult classic, and it lasted for 441 5-minute long episodes from 1966 to 1977. The storyline? Is there a storyline? I don't know, not really. But Dougal, Ermintrude, Dylan and Brian all reside in a magic garden. And on occasion, Zebedee the Jack-in-the-Box and Florence would appear there via the pan-dimensional eponymous roundabout of which we speak. Each of the characters had distinct personalities, with Dougal being a sort of a world-weary grump, so easily the one that I most identified with then. Children loved it and adults were fond of it too, mainly due to its psychedelic links. Dylan was evidently perpetually stoned, slumped as he was against various objects because of his addiction to the weed. Dougal's keenness for sugar lumps was seen as an LSD addiction, while Zebedee's animated jumpiness was thought to be related to him being on speed. The series had a few comebacks, with Nigel Planer and then Jimmy Hibbert voicing revivals after Eric Thompson died, and then someone had the bright idea of making a soulless CGI movie in the late 2000s with Kylie Minogue and Robbie Williams in the lead roles, along with a host of British actors who are far better at acting than Kylie Minogue and Robbie Williams, but a lot worse at making late 90s pop music that's popular with the kids. The Spectrum game was made by a two-man team, Paul Andrew Stoddard and Jay Derritt, for the CRL Group plc. CRL, you might remember, did the rather un-Terrahawksy Terrahawks game that I covered about a year ago. The Magic Roundabout game is at least recognisably Magic Roundabouty. You're cast as Dougal, and once again you have a hankering for them there sugar cubes, but you also need lodgings. We all need lodgings. And the only brick type shape in the Magic Garden, well, it appears to be the self-same sugar cubes that Dougal is hopelessly addicted to. Your task then is to build a house out of the sugar cubes, and you must do it without getting caught under the feet of the other characters, who are mostly friendly to the mop-like dog in the TV show, but here seem to hate his stonemasonry plans. Also, you have a health bar that deteriorates through play, and you must eat the sugar cubes that you're supposed to build the house with. Crikey, there's a decision for you. However, you can find enough sugar cubes in order to build the house without having to worry too much about his insatiable sugar hunger. You build Dougal's saccharine erection by stacking cubes and dragging them to this one small mushroom near the centre of the playfield for some reason or another, because the Magic Roundabout doesn't seem to think it has to explain anything. I've got no idea why this mushroom is so important to the building of the house there of Dougal. You build the residence and you get to do it again in the next level, as that's all there is really to the Magic Roundabout game. It's about Dougal going around this sort of maze and building his house, and that's fine, I guess. But if Dougal's house building is the whole experience, how does it play? Well, it's fine for about 10 minutes or so. Dougal's sprite, it's too big really, and he manoeuvres like a legless hippo in slurry. He can't turn around with his stack of cubes, and he constantly ends up getting stuck to these cardboard trees, which isn't great, as the contact with the other roundabout characters usually ends up with you desperately trying to move your canine character away, usually unsuccessfully. You see, the problem is your lives erode because there's very little in the way of post-hit invulnerability, which really should be a standard feature in games such as this. Graphically, the characters do look like the characters from the Magic Roundabout show, presented here in simple primary colours. And, well, you can't really fault the background for lacking detail when the original show had a few 2D trees in a white void. That said, why is the playfield blue? The Spectrum can do white. Yeah, a yellow dog on a white background might be difficult to spot or even stare at, but you know what? You should have gone with it. It would have looked almost, alright, not very, but much similar to the TV show. But how did the magazines rate it? Well, not that well, no. CMVG gave it a 7, along with a review that was very Magic Roundabout inspired in terms of how it was written, but it was a real bugger to quote from, so I won't do that. Crash Magazine gave it a 51%, saying it may prove popular with young children, but it lacks content for older people. Sinclair User awarded it a 5 out of 10 and informed us that it's not a game to get the adrenaline flowing, but it nevertheless is great to see Dougal and his friends are still around. Which seems right, seeing as the game came out in between the OG Eric Thompson series in the 60s and 70s and the 1992 reboot. If you were to be named after your one defining trait, what would you be called? I would be called Mr. Lazy at editing, Mr. Innuendo, Mr. Lonely, or Mr. Unmotivated. Well, I guess anyway. Or maybe even Mr. Honest or Mr. Self-Deprecating. After these titles, it might be Mr. Hopeful not to play Spectrum educational titles ever again. But I guess we'll get to that. The Mr. Men, as you probably well know, have their origins in children's literature. You know, if you've been a child at any point in the last 50 years, you probably know that. Author Roger Hargreaves penned the first batch of Mr. Men tales in 1971, with each small book introducing a different character with a single defining personality trait. These traits would invariably be used to convey a moral lesson, so your kid might not end up being a vile little sociopath. Maybe more kids today need to read the Mr. Men books, eh? Old man shouting at a cloud. Roger would then go on to make the 1981 book series Little Miss, but would sadly lose his life in 1988, with son Adam continuing his father's work from that point in. The iconic characters of Mr. Happy, Mr. Tickle, Mr. Bump and Mr. Greedy were simple in design and concept, yet beloved by children from the 70s to the present day, with hundreds of tales in the series at this point. The original TV show based on the Mr. Men debuted on BBC One just 3 years after the books did, and they were voiced by Dad's Army alum Arthur Lowe. Yes, Captain Mannering himself. 28 episodes were broadcast, and a follow-up series of Little Miss adventures were voiced by John Alderton and his wife Pauline Collins in 1983. A newer series that combined the two properties emerged on Nick Jr. and Channel 5 in 1995, with a revamped show appearing in 2008 that had a really cool intro sequence with Mr. Tickle on a molesting rampage. 20th Century Fox were aiming to put out an animated movie of Mr. Men several times since 2010, but everything's gone a bit quiet on that since the Disney merger a couple of years ago. It's probably been Mr. Bumped Off. Microsoft acquired the rights to the Mr. Men game license in the early 80s and decided to give you a learning with a series of educational games, starting with First Steps in 1983, then followed by Word Games in 1984, with Here and There bringing up the rear in 1985. Other games were planned by Microsoft under the Mr. Men banner, with Invisible Mr. Men and Mr. Men's Magic Storymaker, however, being cancelled, and thank God for that, because I'd rather not sit through that many educational games at once like I had to do with Paddington. Another game called High Bouncer, based on the adventures of Mr. Bounce rather than the neighbour's Labrador that got married, did make an appearance on the Commodore 64 and BBC Micros in 1985, but Microsoft decided to save the Spectrum the ignominy of its presence. Going with the Spectrum games, First Steps with the Mr. Men has several mini-games, a mixture of the dull and the mundane. Mr. Greedy appears first, and the portly chap is very keen to neck as many ice cream cornets as possible, which are located in the corners of the screen. 5 increasingly difficult screens filled with walls try to separate glutton from dairy, and it's pretty simple stuff as a game for 4-year-olds, as it should be. The 5, 6, 7, 8 and 9 keys, along with the 0 key, are terrible really to manoeuvre your little chap about, but they were designed to work with a key overlay for the children, so I kind of feel I have to let it off. Mr. Silly has to stack hats in the next game, and this is apparently designed to help kids to learn how to read. Apparently read hats. Okay. This also repeats a lot, and I got so bored with Silly's haberdashery hilarity that I forgot to play Mr. Forgetful's wardrobe game and Mr. Forgetful's letter game. How silly and forgetful of me. Crash had a look at it, but it was more a glance than a proper review. though they did say it's too simple for its target audience of 4 to 8 year olds and perhaps should have been aimed at 2 to 6 year olds instead. Word Games with Mr. Men came out next and features an incredible 9 games, which are actually just variants on the same game. That being mastering the words for opposite things. Several Mr. Men sprites are stretched and squashed and contorted like they've eaten a Super Nintendo's Mode 7 chip. And then the Spectrum insults them a lot. Maybe he's not fat, huh? But just big boned, okay? You insensitive microchipped swine. Still, it's the one game where the Mr. Men admit to getting high. That might be why the world just changed colour. He's off his coconut. The game really isn't much beyond this. Either something is this or it's the opposite of that. And there's only 10 combinations or thereabouts of opposites anyway. And whether you type it out or choose from a list, it's severely limited. Crash once again surmised that the age range should have been lowered from its 8-year-old target, as most kids that age have outgrown the Mr. Men. Your Sinclair's precursor, Your Spectrum, gave it a 5 out of 5, which is interesting. Is this how Your Spectrum learned how to read or something? They declared it as the best educational package on the Spectrum. Wow. For that, I actually think you should play Shoe People, because that game is much better. Mind you, it wasn't out at this point, so I shouldn't be too harsh on them. Finally, we have Here and There with the Mr. Men that followed in 1985, and poor old Mr. Tickle is in a terrible state. This collection of blobs is in fact Mr. Tickle, and yes, it is supposed to look like this. I was convinced my computer hadn't loaded the game correctly when I first booted it up. But no, Mr. Tickle is a shattered mess on the outside of this box, and he has to recombobulate himself inside the box, and it's all a bit weirdly gross if you ask me. Mr. Tickle then has to achieve his Me Too complaint by molesting Mr. Grumpy through a window. You must pre-program his grasping mitts to launch through and grab a lump of Mr. Grumpy's meat against his will. There is a follow-up to this, thankfully, where you control 4 Mr. Menzies as they try to surround the rapey orange japester and attempt to bring him to justice. It's like drafts, I think, though I've never actually played drafts. You have to stop Mr. Tickle from reaching the other side of the screen, where I suspect lies a lot of people with a taste for litigation, and only Mr. Bump & Co can stop Mr. Tickle getting the sort of reputation that did for the band The Lost Prophets. Here and There is probably the best out of the 3, certainly the most varied, so thank God for the handsy tangerine sex case and his touchy-feely ways. Crash were once again the only publication to give time to Mirrorsoft's Mr. Men malarkey. They said it was a good, well-designed game which would be useful in a primary school as well as at home. I'm not actually sure what we're supposed to be learning here though. Touching people up at a school? Maybe that explains why that teacher at my school was sacked and wasn't allowed within the grounds of the school again. He must have played this first. Well, that's it then. Now, naturally, Orm Cheep, being a bird and a worm, well, they wouldn't be friends, but instead of the usual dynamic of dinner and diner, this show for the under 5s showed children the birds can survive on friendship alone. They can't. He would eat Orm. Alright. Voiced by Richard Briers, Orm Cheep was a 26-episode series that ran from 1983 to 1985. Cheep was an infant bird that struggled to fly and thus became friends with this subterranean annelid called Orm. They made good friends with some other ropey-looking animal puppets and would try to avoid the malicious intentions of the crow and the rat, who did want to eat them because they're sensible. It's all very quaint and simple and incomprehensible as entertainment now that I'm old. And we'll just leave it at that. Macmillan Software acquired the license to it in 1985, and they commissioned Widget Software to put out a pair of titles, Narrow Squeaks and The Birthday Party. And be worried, kids, because they're educational titles. Both of these games are identical in terms of their graphics, their sound, mechanics, and they both came out at exactly the same time. So I'm going to mash them both together as the same game. If anything, Birthday Party is the slightly deeper game, hilariously, allowing a small amount of adventuring using these illuminated signposts. But these are both light fare, both this and Narrow Squeaks. You start the game by slapping a key on the keyboard as the words Orm and Cheep scroll down the screen, attempting to get all three words as close as you can to the centre of that red line. From this, the game will determine how smart your 5-year-old or 42-year-old man reviewing old computer games is and adjust the game's difficulty accordingly. And then the game begins and you control Cheep. Is he okay? Look at him. He just does this for the whole 2 games. He's sort of twitching. You know, if he's supposed to be a baby bird, and, you know, the kind thing is to do is to put a spade through his neck, because, you know, his mum's not going to take him back into the nest. Anyway, you start out by being really confused as to what the controls are, and then you figure it out. All the keyboard buttons are exactly the same. Yep, all exactly the same. They all do the same thing. It's all keys and none of the keys. These are the simplest controls in Spectrum history and wouldn't be revisited by the computer game industry until those endless runner games that you would play on your iPhone. I can understand what Macmillan Software were attempting. They were aiming at making the game accessible to small children, so one button makes sense. A good way of getting them into computer games and thus ruining their formative years instead of them going outside. One day they'll be making YouTube videos. Oh. My son at the age of 3 completed the Crazy Box challenge in Crazy Taxi, aged 3. And has gone on to fully complete Mario Odyssey, get all the pieces of the ship in ToeJam and Earl, and procured all the Chaos Emeralds in the first Sonic game. He would be incredibly insulted if I sat him down in front of this game, which has the same control method as a door handle or a light switch. The trouble with doing these games where you're aiming for the lowest possible skill set and the lowest possible, experience with reading and things like that, is that a lot of these games have no explanation at all. And it becomes very upsetting to me that I can't play a game designed for 3-year-olds with one control button. Seriously, I have no idea what you do on this level. One of each of these animals makes a noise, and I don't know when I'm supposed to slap the space bar. It's weird. It makes me the most pathetic human being in history. I can't play this game designed for 3-year-olds. The atmosphere in this game, though, it all feels weirdly creepy, and that is to its credit. The crow looks incongruously evil with the rest of the game, and so it's fantastically unsettling, and for that I give Widget Software Macmillan some props. Not sure kids will like it though. They won't. They'll cry. Reviews for the 2 games were mixed. Crash got some kids in to help them review the Orm Cheep games, and they unanimously hated them, and ultimately the game got a poor 42% from that publication. Sinclair User were very forgiving and gave the pair of titles a 4 out of 5 star review, stating that they will appeal to 4 to 7-year-olds and could be a useful addition to the gameplay library. It won't, and it isn't. Don't listen to Sinclair User. They clearly hate your children. As do Yul Sinclair, who gave the game an 8 out of 10, saying that the good, clear and colourful graphics, excellent sound effects, all go to making a solid starter and an educational game. I like the intent of Orm Cheep, but you magazine fellas really do underestimate children. Ah, Paddington. What a lovely little bear. Though really the Browns, well, they're a little bit irresponsible, don't you think? They're a little bit too bloody quick to take in a known to be dangerous wild animal into their family home. I don't care how bloody polite he is at that station. Give him half a chance and he will have Judy's arm off and, well, he'll be ripping into the flesh on Henry's back like that Grizzly in The Revenant. He's a bear. Don't bring bears into your house. Luckily, he didn't do that, and luckily he remained a charmer during his stay with the Brown family. The Browns housing an immigrant and him turning out to be a nice, contributive part of the household and indeed society, well, you can see why the Daily Mail didn't run with that narrative and kept running with that little middle-class Rupert guy who stays isolated in his little rural area with his friends who all have the same accent. You can see why they stuck with that, can't you? You might be as stunned as I was to discover that young Paddington Bear had as many as 5 software titles put out on the ZX Spectrum, courtesy of little-known programmers Collins Software, and they all came out in 1983 and 1984. 5 pieces of software based on Paddington. Now, that's not to say that they were all games. Notice I didn't say games, but we will get to that later. First of all, we need to look at the Evergreen Ursine's long history, albeit in a massively shortened fashion, so we can get to the good stuff, which is games. Way back in 1958, struggling author Thomas Michael Bond penned a children's book called A Bear Called Paddington, a small friendly bear from darkest Peru. He was found at Paddington railway station with a battered case full of marmalade sandwiches, a red hat and a blue coat containing a label that reads, "Please look after this bear. Thank you." There you go, terrible parents. If you want to abandon your kids, but you want to feel assured they'll be brought up by quite a wealthy middle-class family, you know, to numb that nagging guilt in your belly that you've done something terrible, just dump them in a local station with a polite message sewn into that Lonsdale tracksuit top. Job's a good un. I'm sure nothing bad will happen. Not soon after the Browns take the bear into their home, they take him into their hearts, and the success of this initial story led to a near endless slew of stories and collections from Michael Bond that eventually would birth the iconic 1976 series Paddington by Film Fair. Film Fair were the animation team behind the Magic Roundabout, which had a Spectrum game that I covered here, and also the Wombles that also had a video game that I can plug now because I did a video on that, so that's a bit shameless of me, but there they are. There's a link in the top corner to that game. The Paddington series had a very distinct stop motion puppet of Paddington that sort of hangs around in a 2D world that is populated by similarly 2D human characters. I felt really unsettled by this little setup as a child. The very fabric of physics is challenged by this multiple dimensional world, and despite the whole concept of that being as maddening as an Eldritchian horror, you know what, actually it works quite well and it's quite a neat concept. Later animated series that were slightly more traditional in their approach followed in the following decades, as did a pair of movies that looked like they would be absolutely awful from viewing the trailers, but ended up being charming, whimsical efforts that defied all expectations, mainly mine. I was expecting them to be shite, and they weren't shite. Very early on in the Spectrum's life, educational programmers Collinsoft obtained the rights to publish software based on Paddington's license on the Spectrum, the Electron and the Commodore 64, and boy did they publish those games, and boy did they do it quickly. Most of them are decidedly light on content and are mostly not actually games. Yes, the ultimate betrayal of a child's trust. This side, of course, of leaving them on a train platform with a label on them, expecting a family to pick them up and give them a good life, is to sit them down in front of a game, only for that game not to be a game, but some software that's trying to teach them stuff. The horror, then, that is educational software. So let's deal with these in quick order. Paddington's problem picture has you asking the furry-faced critter to fit a shape in the available space in the blue rectangle by pressing a number key that corresponds to the shape. And that's all you do. And he does this. And he does this painstakingly slowly. And that is pretty much it. Wow, yes, and that was £6.10 for that, thank you very much. Objectively, this is the worst value I've ever seen, and it's only just over a £5. Yuck. Worst game I've ever played? Well, possibly. However, you've got to bear in mind that it was meant for the me of its release date in 1983, rather than the me of 2021, so maybe it gets a light pass. Maybe. Not much more advanced is Paddington's Early Visit, which teaches the woods defecating chancer, and indeed those who play along with it, how to read a clock. And once again, you're made to sit there as it draws a clock very, very, very slowly. Sometimes, as an extra treat, it draws 2 clocks, one at a time. Very, very slowly. You'll need the patience of Paddington to get through this one. Paddington and the Disappearing Ink isn't even slightly pretending to be a game. You just get the chance to write a letter with the red-hatted mammal's supervision. By the end of this, you too will be able to compose an abusive correspondence with a cartoon man-tiger like I have here. Paddington's shopping mix-up, and here we get to do sums. Hooray! Choose your type of sum, and after 10 sums, the software gives you a little reward. It lets you play an actual game. It's a barely responsive experience where you must steer Paddington backwards and forwards, catching glacially plummeting apples in a mug. But let's not knock the morsels that we have here on offer. Then you can choose to do more sums or not. If you choose not to do more sums, then you go to the greengrocers where you do more sums, because f*** you, I guess. As poor and low on content these games are, they do come with a Paddington story by Michael Bond in the manual, but still, harumph. Finally, we have Paddington's Garden Game, and it's an actual game. It doesn't even try to teach you anything. With a name like that, I was worried that you were going to get us to differentiate between a potato and a kumquat, Paddington. You had me going, old son. Paddington's Garden Game has the bear on a mission to catch butterflies in a over-the-top view flick screen maze. The butterfly colours denote different amounts of points for each butterfly captured, and all you have to do to catch them is to walk into them. Take that, you fancy coloured moth. Also on offer are the mega points that are garnered for chewing on a marmalade sandwich. You feed that addiction, you little hairy bastard. Sounds pretty simple, doesn't it? Well, it should. It's a game aimed at 5 to 8-year-olds. That said, don't go expecting to finish it completely unhindered. It turns out that hedgehogs and wasps cannot be doing with the naive bear and his bug-capturing escapades, and so they will do what they must to put an end to such tomfoolery. Not only that, but Paddington must be ultra cautious not to trample upon the plants, and if he does, he'll trip and his fun day of imprisoning insects will be done, and his injured frame will be wheeled off for a commisseratory round of marmalade toast. Probably. It's probably better than eating it off the ground in the garden, though, Paddington. This is actually way trickier than it sounds, given that flower beds are quite well known for not actually moving. That said, any sort of contact with any part of Paddington's body will cause him to fall over in immense pain. And that's it really. There's not really more I can add to this review. That's all there is to the game. But you know what? After the educational titles, it's like finding a marmalade sandwich in a pile of slowly generating clocks. The only review of Paddington's Garden Game got it a 4 out of 5 with Sinclair User. They said that it has all the ingredients of arcade action with several screens of action, 3 lives and a task, and the graphics are smooth. I reckon that's a fair score, as for an early effort aimed at kids, Paddington's Garden Game isn't too bad at all. So it's half time now. Thank you very much to me from the past for reviewing those old games, I guess. But yes, go and get your half-time orange, your rub down. I'll see you in a few days for the second bit, when we'll look at stuff like that there, Shoe People. Yeah, Shoe People. As a game on the Spectrum, madness. Anyway, thanks, I'll see you next time. Bye.